Hi guys, and welcome to day 31, an informational text connection and crafting an effective summary. So today's LAQ is how can I effectively summarize an informational article? Our objective is I can compose a dynamic main idea statement and paraphrase supporting details in my summary. This is RI 5.2. So let's go ahead and read the text together. At this point, you can make sure that you are reading along in your packet with me so that you can annotate as we go. Mexican immigration history, longer, more complex than US-Mexican border. Right away, we can see the topic. The topic of this article is the history of Mexican immigration. As we read and we get a better understanding of the main idea, I'll pause and we'll jot down our initial main idea statement as well. The first Mexican Americans didn't cross the border into the US. Instead, the border crossed them. In the 1500s and 1600s, Spain colonized parts of North America. This included Mexico and parts of the present-day southwestern United States. Mexico was a colony of Spain for almost 300 years. Then, in 1821, Mexico won its independence. War breaks out in 1846. War broke out in 1846 when the U.S. took Texas from Mexico. In 1848, the two countries signed a treaty. It was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The U.S. used its military power to force Mexico to give up land. The U.S. paid Mexico a small amount of money, much less than the land was worth. In 1854, the U.S. bought even more land from the Mexican government. Almost overnight, tens of thousands of Mexican citizens no longer lived in Mexico. All of a sudden, without even moving, they were in the United States. New citizens, broken promises. Most of them became U.S. citizens. The U.S. promised that they would have full rights as Americans. These promises were not kept, though. By the end of the 19th century, many Mexican Americans had their land taken away. They were treated like second-class citizens. Life wasn't easy for Mexican Americans in the late 1800s. Still, many Mexicans continued to move to the United States looking for work. Before we read on, I want to go ahead and start to draft our main idea sentence. So I'm going to revisit the title and then just think about some things that we've read. The title states, Mexican immigration history, longer, more complex than US-Mexico border. Now, it did seem a lot more complex because it had to do with the US purchasing land from Mexico and those people automatically now living in the United States when before the purchase they lived in Mexico, so it's very complicated. So I'm going to write down that the main idea sentence is this history of Mexican immigration is long and complicated. I think that definitely looks very similar to the title, and I think it's a good way to get started on wrapping my head around the main idea sentence. I also wanted to mark some pieces of evidence that kind of stuck out to me on this page before we move on. I thought this was really interesting, where it said that almost overnight, tens of thousands of Mexicans no longer lived in Mexico. All of a sudden, without even moving, they were in the United States. That definitely supports the thought that it was a complicated history because people became immigrants to the United States without even moving. It's just their land became owned by the United States, therefore, they became immigrants. That's really interesting. Also, I want to go ahead and mark this piece of evidence where it says by the end of the 19th century, many Mexican Americans had their land taken away. So they had been living on land, and the United States took the land that they were living on. And maybe they were living on land they had previously owned when that land was part of Mexico, and the United States ended up taking it from them. So again, that goes into how the history of the immigration has been very complicated. And let's go ahead and read on. So this is the next part of the text. I really want to keep in mind that main idea statement, so I'm just going to go ahead and bring it up for us. Remember, we're trying to prove that the history is long and complicated. 3 surges of Mexican immigration. Immigration came in 3 great surges. The first began in the 1900s. Between 1910 and 1930, the number of Mexican immigrants tripled. Many workers didn't have permission to immigrate. Moreover, the border where Mexico and the US meet is a vast area. A lot of people crossed the border in what seemed like the middle of nowhere. As a result, many immigrants arrived in the US without any paperwork. I'm going to mark that because that's what made it really complicated for immigrants, was that when they arrived, there was nowhere to present their paperwork. This made it harder for them to speak up for their rights. Powerful people often took advantage of them. The Mexican American community became larger. As it grew, it gained more attention. Let's go ahead and remember our main idea statement. Remember, this is what we're trying to prove, that the history of Mexican immigration is long and complicated. Some groups saw the growing Mexican immigration population as a problem. Immigrants spoke a different language and had different ideas about life. This bothered some Americans. Some tried to force immigrants to learn English and mix in. Hard times in the Great Depression. We remember this from Esperanza Rising. This was when Esperanza Rising was facing difficulty in the novel. In the 1930s, the Great Depression hit. It made life for Mexican immigrants especially hard. During the Great Depression, many people lost their jobs. As a result, anger at immigrant workers grew. Tensions ran high. There were few good jobs to go around, and some people didn't want jobs going to immigrants. The government began sending immigrants back to Mexico. Many were either tricked or forced to make the trip. In all, hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants were sent away in the 1930s. However, many Mexican Americans stayed. Some of them helped build the railroads. They moved to areas all over the country. More of them started living in American cities. And in this section, we see a lot of history that we noticed was mentioned and involved in the storyline of Esperanza Rising. Let's remind ourselves of the main idea. World War II and braceros. In the 1400s, the U.S. fought in World War II. Thousands of young men were sent off to war. Back at home, people were needed to do their jobs. In 1942, the government started telling Mexicans to come to the U.S. Farmers needed workers, so the governments of the two countries started a program called the Bracero Program. The workers were called braceros. Those that came were usually paid very little. Many were treated very badly. After the war, the soldiers returned home. This meant that there were once again enough workers in the country. The U.S. began kicking out immigrant workers in response. More than 4 million immigrants were sent back to Mexico. So I wanted to bring your attention to that middle paragraph because a program was started to bring Mexicans from Mexico to the United States to work in a special program. And then when soldiers returned from the war, those workers were sent back to Mexico. Again, it's a long, complicated history, and that's what we're trying to prove, and those 2 pieces of evidence would absolutely support that. Farm workers struggle for their rights. Some Mexican Americans pushed back. In the 1960s and 70s, the United Farm Workers, UFW, helped farm workers organize. One of the leaders of the effort was Cesar Chavez. He gained national fame. He became a symbol for immigrant rights. This was also the time of the Civil Rights Movement. Quite a few Mexican Americans participated. The third great wave in Mexican immigration is taking place right now. Mexican immigrants have a more central place in American cultural life than ever before. They have an important role to play in its future, too. So step one of completing our daily task is to write a dynamic main idea statement. We've been practicing using the acronym IVTB, in which we identify the type of text. We use a verb to talk about how or what the author is doing, the topic, and then the big idea or the main idea. So let's practice. Identify the text. The article, this is an article, describes, we already know the topic, the history of Mexican immigration. And we know that the big idea is that they're saying it's long and complicated. So let's put it together. The article describes the history of Mexican immigration as long and complicated. If you want to pause the video and jot that down as your dynamic main idea statement, that would be a good idea. Now let's talk about the support. In order to support a dynamic main idea sentence, you have to do two things. The first thing is review your text annotations. Go back and see what you marked. Mark all the evidence that you have that supports your main idea statement the best. You might have 10 pieces of supporting evidence. You have to choose which two you think are the most important. Second, paraphrase your chosen supports and add them to your summary with transitions. It said in the article stated, the second section of the article said, but remember, we're not citing it using quotation marks. We're putting the evidence in our own words. Good luck, write well, ask for help if needed. Remember to reach out to me, do not hesitate. And send me a pic, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day.